Welcome to Bioethics for a Better World, a podcast about living our vision through ethics for Providence St. Joseph Health caregivers. Each episode, a professional ethicist from the Theology and Ethics Department will host a conversation about ethics topics across healthcare, from the bedside to the boardroom. Together, we ask questions about what it means to truly create health for a better world.
Hi, everyone, and welcome to our very first episode. I'm Jordan Mason, a clinical ethicist for Providence St. Joseph Health in Northern California. I'm here with fellow ethicists Jennifer Dunatov and Jacqueline Haratunian-Ketz. Jennifer is our Senior Director of Ethics in Southern California, and Jackie is a clinical ethicist also in Southern California. Jennifer and Jackie, thank you for joining me today.
Thanks for having us.
Thanks, Jordan.
So our topic of conversation today is the Ethical and Religious Directives for Catholic Healthcare Services, or ERDs. In Catholic healthcare, we often hear references to the directives or the acronym ERD. I've even heard some of our caregivers say ERD. But what are the ERDs, Jennifer?
Thanks, Jordan. Well, the ERDs, or the Ethical and Religious Directives for Catholic Healthcare Services, are a guiding document in Catholic healthcare. It's published by the United States Conference of Catholic Bishops and is currently in its 6th edition. The purpose of the ERDs is to provide both ethical principles and guidance for clinical and organizational decisions involving Catholic services, patients, and providers. The ERDs are a document that are formally put out by the U.S. bishops, but it was actually a very small group of moral theologians in collaboration with the bishops that worked on this document, some of whom are alive and with us today. And it changes. Whenever we approach a revision, it is usually in response to a really important question that's at the top of everyone's mind, within church life or within our culture at large. And it is a guiding document that again speaks to central issues and themes that are important to the Catholic Church writ large, but are so context dependent and are always interpreted and applied in light of unique patient scenarios.
For me, I tend to use the analogy of the U.S. Constitution. Just as the U.S. Constitution was written to be a foundational document that then requires significant interpretation as the American experiment, as we might call it, unfolds, we similarly have a foundational document that helps guide us and is subject to interpretation and debate.
I would probably say a very abridged version of what both of you said, which is just that it's a document that has general guidance that's important to the Catholic Church and to the healthcare ministry of the Catholic Church, but it's something that has to be interpreted in each specific patient situation. It's not a rule book. Yeah, it's a living document. It has to be interpreted and interpreted well by people who are trained to be able to understand the theological and ethical language that's in there. It's not written for doctors and nurses necessarily. It's written for people who have that training to be able to interpret it. And we know that there are many myths about the ERDs out there. So I thought we could do some myth busting. And Jackie, maybe you could get us started. What is a myth about the ERDs?
I think one of the myths that is most common is that the ERDs are some sort of rule book. And they're really not. If you spend some time reading the document, you'll find that many, many directives are much more aspirational. They call us to achieve an ideal of healthcare of compassion and respect with our patients and with our colleagues, rather than telling us, thou shalt do this or thou shalt not do this. There are a few which are more specific about our call to live our Catholic identity in very specific ways, but the majority of them, such as the very first directive that calls us to perform our ministry in the spirit of the gospel, are much more a calling to live our work and our vocation well.
Wonderful. And what about you, Jennifer? Any myths you'd like to bust?
One I'd like to bust is around the ERDs not being self-interpreting. So when a document is not self-interpreting, what we mean by that is that its meaning or significance isn't immediately evident from the document itself. As you can imagine, we can think of a number of unique scenarios in the delivery of healthcare. So interpretation becomes really necessary to understand the document in context with the situation that we are trying to understand. So I love what Jackie said about this document not being a rule book, because that gives us a very fixed and static idea of what the document represents. But it's actually a very dynamic document that, yes, speaks to very clear church teaching, but also leaves all this beautiful room for application in service to patients and caregivers, depending on their unique context. Another myth I'd love to bust is that the ERDs are not only about women's reproductive health. That is a very common misconception. The ERDs are actually divided into 6 parts that touch on much more beyond reproductive health in general. Part 1 speaks to social responsibility. It talks about how Catholic healthcare is guided by 5 normative principles: a commitment to promote human dignity, a commitment to care for the poor and vulnerable, the importance of contribution to the common good, how important it is for us to be responsible stewards of resources, and reaffirms our commitment to care in alignment, of course, with church teaching. Part 2 is all around pastoral and spiritual responsibility. Talks about how pastoral care is integral to Catholic healthcare with professionally trained chaplains. And I love this idea that it embraces the whole person: mind, body, social, and spiritual well-being is very much at the center of part 2. Part 3 talks about the professional-patient relationship, again, grounding this conversation in respect for human dignity, a thread that we see woven throughout the document. It talks about respect for autonomy, why free and informed consent is so important in our professional-patient interactions, and of course speaks to the right of patients to make treatment decisions and surrogate decision makers to be able to make those decisions when they are unable to speak for themselves. Part 4, the part that gets emphasized so much related to issues in women's reproductive health, addresses a variety of issues at the beginning of life. Again, touching on this idea that the human person is made in God's image and life from the very beginning is sacred. Part 5 talks about issues at the end of life, reiterating and emphasizing important points like informed decision-making, even when a patient can't speak for themselves, the importance of providing adequate pain relief when patients are suffering. It speaks to issues like euthanasia, aid in dying, and the church's perspective on those very prominent topics. And finally, part 6 talks about collaborative arrangements. So now we're in the arena of organizational ethics. And this piece was reworked very extensively as a part of the latest 6th edition of the ERDs. This speaks to the changing landscape of the delivery of healthcare, which may include the expansion of services. It speaks to forming new partnerships between Catholic and non-Catholic entities. So what does that mean? What types of questions do we want to consider when we partner with other organizations which may or may not be Catholic? So you can see that there are plenty of areas that are touched in the conversation around ERDs beyond issues in women's reproductive health.
Yes, wonderful. So now that we know a little bit more about the content and what's in the ERDs, I'm wondering if you could share a little bit of background about how the directives were developed.
So this history is quite fascinating and may bust some myths along the way as well. We know that across the country, Catholic healthcare is in some places over 150 years old. And many Catholic sisters and some brothers were called across the country by bishops or local leaders because of the needs of the community to have access to healthcare services, especially those who could not afford to have physicians come to their home in an era of home practice. And so as Catholic healthcare begins to spring up across the US, we don't have what we have today, which is these interconnected systems where hospitals are coordinated together. And so at one point, folks around Catholic healthcare decide that it would be great if we could communicate better and have more collaboration for the work that we all collectively do. So in 1915, the Catholic Health Association of the United States was formed. And from there, they formed their own ethics committee. And recognizing that they wanted to have a collaborative approach that brings Catholic identity to the specific issues that were faced in the hospitals, they asked the Catholic Health Association Ethics Committee, at that point chaired by Father Michael Burke, in 1921 to write a surgical code for Catholic hospitals. So that was written, and it was accepted by the Archdiocese of Detroit, among others, as being a norm to follow in that diocese. In 1948, the Catholic Health Association releases the first edition of what are now called the Ethical and Religious Directives. So this comes from the surgical code, but takes a kind of pivot away from do's and don'ts and looks more comprehensively at the Ministry of Healthcare. So the Ethical and Religious Directives started with the Catholic Health Association and were really pioneered by those working in healthcare at the time. The document is revised in 1949, 1956, and 1971. And at this time, each revision needed to be adopted by the local diocese, and the local ordinary or the local bishop always had the final interpretive power. By this time, changes in theological method and debate led to the request by CHA that the National Conference of Catholic Bishops, what we now call the United States Conference of Catholic Bishops, were asked to take over the document to promote a more shared approach. This helps to bring a truly national approach to the Ministry of Catholic Healthcare. So in 1971, the bishops jointly issue a new edition, revising in 1994, 2001, and 2018. And currently, we are in the process of revisions for what will become the 7th edition.
So we have this document that's designed to help guide us in certain ethically ambiguous areas, right? This is kind of the idea. Could you talk a little bit about its interpretation? Like, do we have to double check it every time we make an important decision?
Great question, Jordan. The short answer is no. We do not need to continuously refer back to the document for every decision we might be faced with in Catholic healthcare. Again, it is meant to be a guiding document that highlights the key commitments of the Catholic moral tradition as it relates to healthcare. And a really important note is we don't expect all of our caregivers to have a comprehensive understanding of the ERDs or to be able to unpack and apply the ERDs as we might expect of our ethicists or moral theologians. So on that note, interpretation of the document and application is actually best done in collaboration with a professional ethicist or individual with formal training.
Great. That's such a great point. And I'm curious, just for fun, do either of you have a favorite directive?
My favorite is Directive 3, which talks about the responsibility of Catholic healthcare to be an advocate and have special concern for those at the margins of society. And this, I think, is really important for us to remember every single day, specifically because so many people who walk through our doors may not look like they're from a marginalized community, but the more that we encounter their personality and their experience of their healthcare, but also of their life, we might realize that this person is from a marginalized community that we have a special call to consider and think about in a special way that might lead to larger projects and larger ways that we can influence our own community.
I have a favorite directive, Jackie, that is so similar in theme, and that's Directive 23. Directive 23 reads, the inherent dignity of the human person must be respected and protected regardless of the nature of the person's health problem or social status. The respect for human dignity extends to all persons who are served by Catholic healthcare. So I can relate to your sentiments, Jackie. This serving of all people, regardless of distinction, regardless of status, whoever walks through the door, we treat with dignity because that dignity, we believe, is inherent to every human person. And I think that is such an important central core commitment to who we are and how we do what we do at Providence St. Joseph Health.
Yes, absolutely. Well, thank you both so much for this introduction to the ERDs. For our listeners, we have a short call to action for you, which is go find the ERDs for yourself. Maybe search for them online. They should just pop right up. And read the general introduction, which can be found on pages 6 and 7, which will give you just even more of an overview of what the ERDs are all about. It's a fantastic 2-page introduction specifically to the Catholic Church's commitment to healthcare ministry and some of these themes that we have discussed today. Thank you so much.
Thank you for joining us for this episode of Bioethics for a Better World. Please remember that this podcast is not designed to diagnose or treat any medical conditions, nor substitute for an ethics consultation with a professional ethicist.